When all is said and done, nearly $14 billion will have been spent by parties, campaigns, and outside groups on the various elections in 2020. That's more money than the annual budgets of 14 states. And after all those dollars were spent, what actually changed across the country? Hello, and welcome to NCSL's State Elections 2020 briefing. My name is Ben Williams, and I will be moderating this webinar today. I'm a policy specialist with the Elections and Redistricting program here at NCSL. Before I get to the agenda and today's speakers, I need to go through a few housekeeping measures. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. We encourage participation through our chat box, so feel free to type in your questions and answer any questions in the chat box, which is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. We'll be asking 1 or 2 questions after each speaker finishes their presentation, and we will have more time once everyone is finished for additional Q&A. In order to build familiarity with the chat function, please go ahead and type into the chat box which state you're viewing this from. At the bottom of the screen, you will also see a tab labeled Resources. There you can find a downloadable PDF of today's PowerPoint, as well as any other handouts the speakers may have provided. This webinar is optimized for use in Google Chrome. We recommend that anyone using another browser who's experiencing technical difficulties try signing in through Chrome instead. And if you continue to experience technical difficulties after that, please email registration@ncsl.org. And lastly, today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to access the recording will be emailed to you within the week. Now, with all that out of the way, let's go over today's agenda. First, NCSL Elections and Redistricting Policy Fellow Amanda Zock will review the ballot measures that were voted on last week and discuss trends for the future. Then, our Executive Director and State Elections Expert, Tim Story, will review the balance of power in states pre- and post-election and its impacts on a variety of issues, including redistricting. Next, NCSL's Director of Elections and Redistricting, Wendy Underhill, will discuss the administrative side of elections, including how states adapted their processes to the COVID-19 pandemic. Then our Director of Leadership and International Programs, Stacy Householder, will go over what we can expect with new leadership in state legislatures. And with that, I'm going to turn it over now to our wonderful Amanda Zock. Amanda?
Thanks, Ben. So like Ben mentioned, I'm going to be talking about ballot measures today and how they fared in the states. And for those of you who don't know, ballot measures are the policy questions that voters get to decide. And ballot measure results give us a sense of what changes in policies voters want. And that may be indicative of what we will see in the next legislative session. So we can think about ballot measures as voters' opportunity to legislate. And there are 3 types of ballot measures, each defined by the way they get on the ballot. Many, in fact, most are put there by legislatures. Some come from citizens through the citizen initiative process, and a small handful are popular referenda, which is when voters try to overturn a bill that the legislature has passed. So like I said, legislative referrals are the most common form of ballot measure, and that's because all states can use it. And in all but one of the states, that's Delaware, changes to the Constitution must go before voters. On this map, you can see the 24 states in orange that provide a citizen initiative process. And some of those states also allow popular referenda. And then 2 states in teal, that's Maryland and New Mexico, they each only have a process for popular referenda. So if you're in one of those greenish states, this process may be far less familiar to you. And each of those orange states has its own process for how citizens put a measure on the ballot. No 2 states are the same. And some have an easier process than the others, but I want to stress that it's never easy to get a question on the ballot. Far more ideas are generated than ever make it to the ballot. And in fact, this year, there were far fewer citizen initiatives than in the past due to the effects of the pandemic. So just quickly, I want to touch on some of the pros and cons of the initiative process. Voters tend to pursue the initiative process because they can be used to address issues that are not tackled by legislatures, and marijuana has typically been one of those topics. Initiatives can be a way to engage voters on important issues or to increase voter turnout sometimes, and they may also be used to hold elected officials accountable. But from a legislative perspective, and that's what we focus on here at NCSL, laws created through the initiative process may have some drawbacks. Initiatives may result in unaccountable policy making or policies not vetted through the deliberative legislative process. And some past measures may actually have unexpected or unanticipated consequences. Ballot measure campaign spending is unlimited. It may be hard to track. Voter information may be inadequate, especially for complex issues. And significantly, it's not always citizens or voters pushing an issue. It can be groups, organizations, corporations, sometimes people or voters from outside the state, and that may make the citizen part of this process a little murky. So, what did voters see on their ballots this November? There were 38 of these citizen initiatives, 77 legislative referrals, and then 4 popular referenda. So in total, that's 124 measures. And if you are out there doing the math quickly, you can see that these numbers only add up to 118. And that's because Washington State also had 4 non-binding advisory questions about taxes. And Iowa had 1 oddball. It's an automatic ballot question that occurs every 10 years and asks voters if they want a constitutional convention. They usually don't, and this year was no different. Californians had the longest ballots. They saw 12 different questions, and Colorado was a close second with 11. So you'll see those states pop up a lot in the overview that's to come. So 124 measures before the voters. What passed? Voters passed over 2/3 of the total measures, and that may go up a little bit. There are a couple out there that are still either too close to call or we're waiting for more results to come in. 25 of the 38 citizen initiatives passed, and at least 60 of the legislative referrals passed. So that's about 75%. And legislative referrals typically pass at higher rates than citizen initiatives, so no surprises there. And then 2 of the 4 popular referenda were approved. So before I move on to specifics, I want to note that I can't possibly touch on every single ballot measure. Like I said, there were 124 of them. And instead, I will highlight different trends, hot topics, or anything that stuck out as particularly unique or interesting this year. I'm also not an expert on each of these topics or policy areas, but NCSL as a whole does have an expert on every topic. So if you have questions and I can't answer them, I can certainly put you in touch with someone who can. So, what are the headlines this year? Marijuana was huge. There were 8 measures across 5 states, and every single one passed. So here you can see the state names in green, and that means that those measures passed. Later on, when we'll see measures that failed, those states will be in red. So Mississippi and South Dakota both legalized medical marijuana, and Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota all legalized recreational or adult use marijuana. So that's especially a big change in South Dakota, moving from no legal marijuana to legalized medical and recreational marijuana at the same time. All of these measures were citizen initiatives, except for the measure from New Jersey, which came from the legislature. And as I said, all of these measures passed, all marijuana measures passed, but so did all of the other drug legalization or decriminalization measures. And 2020 was historic because it was the first time that psilocybin or magic mushrooms were the subject of a statewide initiative. A few cities had actually decriminalized it through ballot measures, including Denver, and then voters in DC decided to join them by decriminalizing the substance and other entheogenic plants and fungi. And then in Oregon, voters passed a citizen initiative legalizing psilocybin. And so it's the first state in the nation to do so. Oregon voters also passed a measure decriminalizing small amounts of other drugs, such as cocaine and heroin. And that same measure created a drug addiction treatment and recovery program, which will be funded in part by the state's prison savings. Health was also a big topic this year. And so cigarette and nicotine taxes were a large part of that. In particular, 2 states, Colorado and Oregon, each passed those tobacco nicotine taxes. And then in Oklahoma...
Mandy, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we don't see your slides. Do you know how to put them up at this point? Maybe you need to click on the slides tab.
Wendy, the audience can see your slides, but we can't see it on the presenter side.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Mandy. Apologies.
Okay, that's fine. Audience, if you can't see them, let us know, though, just so we can make sure. As I was saying, in Oklahoma, voters rejected a measure related to cigarette taxes and funds that would have reallocated money from the state's tobacco settlement and endowment trust fund in order to fund the state's Medicaid program. And that program was actually expanded through a ballot measure during the primaries. I didn't mention this earlier, but 8 measures were also voted on earlier this year. Some other health-related measures include abortion, and voters split on whether to enact abortion restrictions. So Colorado rejected them, and then Louisiana approved them. Another highlight or kind of first-time measure this year was paid family and medical leave insurance, and that was approved on the ballot for the first time ever. Previous programs were all created through the legislature, and so that happened in Colorado. And then sex ed also made its debut on the ballot this year. Earlier in the year, Washington legislators had passed a bill requiring public schools to provide comprehensive sex education for all students. And some voters did not like that bill, so they got it on the ballot for voter approval, essentially a check on the legislature's power. And ultimately, Washington voters decided to stick with the legislature's decision and keep the sex ed policy. So criminal and civil justice was also a big topic, though as you will see, voters rejected a number of these measures. In California, voters rejected stricter parole and sentencing policies, and they also stopped the legislature's plan to replace cash bail with pretrial risk assessments. Kentuckians may have had some deja vu this year as they weighed in on Marsy's Law, which is also known as the Crime Victims' Bill of Rights. So they voted on this for the second time. The state had passed the measure in 2018, but issues with the ballot language meant that the measure was overturned. And supporters got a second chance this year, and voters approved it again. And then in Nebraska and Utah, voters in both states decided to remove slavery as a punishment from the state's constitutions. And Colorado voters had approved a similar measure in 2018. A few other notable measures in this topic area. In Michigan, voters okayed a measure requiring search warrants for electronic data. And then in Oklahoma, voters failed a measure that would have prohibited the use of the convicted person's former felony convictions to calculate future punishments. Gun rights and regulations were also on the ballot this year, and I'd like to point out my excellent image. It was the only gun image I could find in Microsoft PowerPoint, and it's a water gun. In Alabama, voters approved 2 measures that will allow stand your ground rights to apply to churches in 2 different counties. A measure in Montana seeks to remove local government's authority to regulate firearms, and that includes concealed carry laws. So this one was very close, but it looks like supporters have eked out a win. And then in Utah, voters decided to enshrine hunting and fishing as rights in the state's constitution. So now we have come to my personal favorite policy area, which is elections. And one of the biggest trends this year was that 3 states all passed measures revising their constitutions from saying that every citizen can vote to only a citizen can vote. Of course, citizenship is already a requirement for voting, and these changes seem more symbolic than anything else. Though in Colorado, at least, it may mean that 17-year-olds can no longer vote in primaries if they will be 18 at the time of the next general election. Other election reform measures fared less well on the ballot this year. So ranked choice voting, which is used in a presidential election for the first time in Maine, or was used, I should say, that failed on the ballot in Massachusetts. And it's also on the ballot in Alaska as well. So we're still waiting to see how that one shakes out. It looks to be close. The Alaska initiative would also establish a top 4 primary. So some other notable election measures include Californians opting to extend voting rights to people on parole. Oops, went to the wrong slide. All right. Californians opting to extend voting rights to people on parole, and then rejecting a measure to allow 17-year-olds to vote in primaries if they will be 18 at the time of the next general election. And so those 2 measures together, I think, serve as a good reminder that the measures that voters pass or fail don't necessarily represent a cohesive agenda. In Colorado, voters approved the legislature's decision to join the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which means that once enough states have joined the compact, the state will commit to giving its electoral votes to the winner of the nation's popular vote. As it stands, 15 states and DC have all joined the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and that totals 196 electoral votes. 270, the winning number, are necessary for it to go into effect. And then in Florida, voters said no to open primaries and a top 2 primary system. Redistricting, of course, is on everyone's minds. It's right around the corner now that the census is complete. And voters in 3 states asked their legislatures to make some changes. So the New Jersey measure, which passed, will postpone the Garden State's legislative redistricting process. Missouri's ballot measure was a response to one that passed in 2018, and it will return the state's redistricting process to a bipartisan commission and eliminate the role of the nonpartisan state demographer. And then Virginia's measure, which has probably gotten the most attention, will transfer the power for redistricting from the legislature to a commission. And all of these measures were referred to the ballot by the legislatures themselves. It's no surprise that taxes were on the ballot. They are always a popular topic when it comes to ballot measures, and some states actually require that certain tax changes go before the voters. So several this year sought to increase revenue. In Alaska, and as you can see, this one is gray because it's yet to be called, voters weighed in on a tax increase on oil and gas production. And then in Arizona, voters approved increasing income taxes on incomes over $250,000, with the revenue going toward teachers' salaries and schools. In Arkansas, voters approved a continuation of the current sales tax that funds the state's highway system. And in California, Prop 15 failed. It would have required all commercial and industrial real estate properties to be assessed at their full market value, as opposed to their purchase price, with that additional revenue going to schools and local governments. And then in Colorado, voters approved the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment, which set property tax assessment rates in the state constitution. And that decision will prevent future cuts to the property taxes and stabilize revenue for schools and local governments. But of course, there seem to be just as many efforts to limit taxes and limit revenue as there are to increase it. In Colorado, for example, voters approved an income tax reduction and a measure requiring voter approval on all new fee-based state enterprises, which is part of the state's Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. Taxes, like I said, tend to be fraught issues at the ballot box. They're always there, and voters often split on them. But one particular area that always receives overwhelming support is tax deductions and exemptions for veterans and sometimes their spouses. And so that was no different this year when measures in 3 different states passed with large margins. In Florida, the measure actually passed with about 90% of the vote, which is a pretty big deal. So some issues like taxes are always on the ballot, but some issues were new this year. I mentioned psilocybin earlier, and another emerging issue is technology. So California voters passed Prop 22 this year, and that will require app-based transportation and delivery drivers, like those who drive for Uber or DoorDash, to be classified as independent contractors and not employees. This has been the most expensive ballot measure campaign in American history. About $200 million have been spent, most of it on the pro sign. And I will add here that this is an instance where the citizen part of citizen initiative has gotten a little bit lost, right? Most of that spending isn't coming from individual citizens, but companies like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash. In Massachusetts, voters passed a measure requiring vehicle manufacturers to use a standardized open data platform, and that's so both drivers and independent repair technicians can access mechanical data and diagnostics for the vehicle. I mentioned this earlier with criminal justice, but the Michigan measure requiring a search warrant to access electronic data also fits into this category as well. So I don't have a crystal ball, but I bet we'll see tech on the ballot more and more as time goes by. And speaking of betting, it's no surprise that gambling and lotteries are on the ballot. They often are, and this year was no different. In fact, all of the gambling and lottery measures seem to have passed so far. So in Maryland and South Dakota, voters passed measures related to sports betting. And then in Nebraska, voters approved 3 measures, all related to gambling at racetracks. And in Colorado, voters approved a change to gaming types and bet limits in certain local jurisdictions. So as I said, I can't talk about all of the measures, and let's be honest, some are not the kind to make headlines. But if you want to know more about them, NCSL has a statewide ballot measures database where you can find information about every single measure this year and going back into the past. But in the spirit of not being boring, I want to end with a few other notable measures. So, voters in Arkansas, Florida, and North Dakota all rejected efforts that would have made the citizen initiative process more challenging. An effort in California to overturn the state's affirmative action ban failed. Coloradans approved a citizen initiative to reintroduce gray wolves, and it's the first time voters in any state have had a say in bringing back an endangered species. Florida voters passed a citizen initiative to raise the minimum wage to $15, and similar measures in the last 5 years have all passed. Puerto Rico voted yes on statehood, and this is the 6th time that voters have weighed in on statehood since 1967, though it's the first time that voters have given a definitive yes to the question. Further action, of course, still rests with Congress. Rhode Islanders decided to change the state's name, so don't worry, Rhode Island will still be Rhode Island, but the state's official name is the State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. And voters chose to remove Providence Plantations from that official title. And then the last highlight is from Mississippi. Mississippi voters approved a brand new state flag this year. The legislature earlier in the year had decided to retire the previous flag because it contained the Confederate battle emblem. And the new flag, as you can see, features the state flower, the magnolia, and it's already flying in different locations across the state. So you can find more information about this measure or any of the statewide ballot measures on NCSL's ballot measure database. And then if you have questions for me, please feel free to ask them today or to follow up with me. My email address and phone number are on the screen. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandy. We got a couple of questions. I'm going to go ahead and ask you one now, and we'll hold off on the rest until after the rest of the presenters have gone. So this was the first one to come in, so it'll get to be the one that's asked now. It's from Donald Cohen, and he asks, for the psilocybin measure, was the motivation criminal justice reform, or was it a health policy rationale for why that measure was put forward? I presume this is primarily about Oregon, but
I guess I can't speak exactly to the motivation of the sponsors, but the measure itself has some health-related aspects. So it is in part to use psilocybin in a more medical capacity, still notable for being the first state to ever legalize it in any capacity. And the other measure that decriminalized certain substances like heroin and cocaine, those were two separate measures in Oregon, but they do kind of go hand in hand since the reduction of kind of criminal charges based on having some of those substances will go to fund different drug addiction and treatment recovery programs. So the civil and health aspects are kind of linked in both measures.
Of course. Right. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Mandy. Mandy's going to be staying on and will be available in the Q&A at the very end. So those of you who have already asked questions for her, we'll get to those then. And for those of you who are still thinking about what you want to ask, you have time to ruminate while we hear our other speakers. So thank you, Mandy. And now I'm going to hand it over to Tim Story, who's going to talk about the numbers in the states. Tim?
Ben, thank you for pitching it to me, and thank you everybody for being on the call. We get pretty geeked out about the legislative elections and the ballot measures, and we love sharing this and maybe giving you the overview and highlighting a few facts that you haven't seen thus far in various media coverage. So thanks for being with us. I am going to pretty much race through some slides here, and we did this the other day. We did sort of another version of this a couple of days ago, and we ended early, and I think it was partly because there wasn't nearly as much to talk about in terms of the legislative elections as is typically the case from year to year. So I'm going to give you the big headline: not much change at the state level. That's why the title of this little part of the presentation is called 2020 Election, Steady States. the era of the states will continue in terms of policymaking, because we all know that there's not a tremendous amount of optimism that gridlock is going to suddenly fade away in Washington. So I think one thing we can count on is that the states, which are increasingly either Republican or Democrat and seem to be dialed in on those things right now, at least for 2 election cycles, the real problem solving and solving America's issues is going to happen in the states. And that's why this is so important, in addition to redistricting, which I'll also talk about. So thank you for being with us. Let me start just quickly. As is always the case, every 2 years, there's a lot of action in legislative elections. There were only 11 governor's races this year, 12 if you count Puerto Rico. And so if you were going to sort of change the partisan landscape in states, it was going to happen in the 6,000 legislative races across the country. In 44 states, there's 6 states where there were no legislative elections, 4 that hold their elections in odd-numbered years, and then Maryland and Alabama, who hold their elections on a 4-year cycle, and they won't be up again until 2022. So you had 6,000 legislative seats up, 11 governors in the states, plus the governor of Puerto Rico. And then heading into the election, Republicans have been in kind of the majority of control across the board in terms of governors and legislatures since 2010, that sort of overwhelmingly successful election for Republicans on the eve of redistricting. And those two things are certainly connected. And if you looked at it before the election, there were 29 legislatures controlled by Republicans, 19 by Democrats, and only 1 divided, where the House was controlled by the Democrats in Minnesota and the Senate controlled by Republicans. And that's remarkable. You have to go all the way back to 1914 to have so few divided legislatures. And guess what happened in this election? Nothing changed. One quick thing, also leading into this election, the Democrats had sort of the wind at their backs. They had a good election in 2018. Always the party outside of control of the White House is very successful. It's almost every single midterm election back to 1900, which is how far back our really solid data goes. That was also the case in 2018. And then in 2019, Democrats picked up the Virginia Senate and the Virginia House to take full control of the Virginia legislature, as well as the state, the trifecta, with the governor of Virginia being Democratic. And I'll come back to that again in just a second. Let me move on. Sorry about that. So what happened in this election? You have to be paying really close attention. Let me just sort of to see what changed on this map. One change: New Hampshire. The New Hampshire legislature, which has been the most competitive legislature over the past decade, really. The New Hampshire House has changed party control 6 of the past 8 elections. And once again, this time the Republicans took the majority, now have over 15 seats in that 400-member state legislative house. And of course, the New Hampshire Senate is much smaller, and the Republicans appear to have a 1-seat advantage, 2 seats. So 1 seat would leave it tied in the New Hampshire Senate. So Republicans pick up both the New Hampshire Senate and the New Hampshire House. And that's the only major change. So that's kind of the altered states. That leaves, by the way, Republicans with 30 legislatures, 18 in Democratic hands, and 1 split. They have to go all the way back to 2018 to only have 1 divided legislature, and before that back to the 1914, like I said. So when you look at this altered states map, usually there would be roughly 10 or 12 states on this map, because every 2-year election cycle, 12 legislative chambers switch party control on average. So the fact that there's only 2 in this election and only 4 chambers in this election cycle. So let's kind of pull in the 2019 and and other changes that happen. So if you look at altered legislatures in terms of the cycle, like I said, you pull in Virginia. I also have Alaska on this map, because the Alaska House has been led by a coalition of a small part of the Republican caucus, along with all of the Democrats, elected an independent speaker. So you kind of had a coalition in Alaska, which now appears that the Republicans are going to unify and have, once again, a Republican speaker and a Republican control. So they have the numbers on paper both before and after the election, but in a way it's also a pickup for Republicans. And if you'll also see, we've got Puerto Rico here. It would appear that both chambers of Puerto Rico have now switched party control. Of course, they don't use the Democrat and Republican Party labels. They have different parties. And it was essentially the statehood party, which has now come back into control after being out of control for at least 2 years. So then you factor in the governors. Like I said, there was very little action on the governor's side of the equation. Only 11 state governors up for grabs. Only one of those was considered competitive, and in the end, it was kind of the Republican in Montana, Greg Gianforte, who was the former member of Congress, switched that from Democrat to Republican. So only one change on the governor front. Republicans now control 27 of the governor's mansions, 23 are Democrats. And then you pull it all together. So how much has changed? Again, the change in the coalition in Alaska, the governor's change in Montana, the 2 chambers in Virginia in 2019, the 2 chambers in New Hampshire, and of course the changes in Puerto Rico. So big story here, not a lot of change. And that sort of filters in when you look at who has that overall trifecta control. Republicans 24 states, Democrats 15 states, and 11 are divided in some way, with not all 3, House, Senate, and governor, being in the hands of one party. You do have a handful of states where you got a veto-proof majority. That's certainly important. In Kansas, where Republicans have the veto-proof majority over the of course, the Democratic governor. Same thing is the case in Kentucky. And then in Delaware, it's all Democrats, but it is a super majority over veto override majority. And in Vermont, it's a Democratic legislature with a super majority numbers over the Republican governor. So how have things changed over time? Republicans, again, seem to have increased their number of legislative seats. I say again, I shouldn't say that, because they took a pretty hard downturn in the 2018 election, but now they have ticked back up. And this was a surprise. I think most people thought the Democrats had the wind at their back, and it was the Republicans playing defense. And that was certainly the case when I talked to Republican leaders as well as Democratic leaders around the country and people involved in these campaigns. So if there was any surprise, it was that Republicans actually fared a little bit better than people had expected. And now they control close to 55% of all legislative seats. So going back all the way to 1900, it was sort of back and forth in the first half of the last century. And then about 1952, Democrats controlled legislative seats in terms of total number of seats for around 50 years. But Republicans took over in 2010 and have now had the majority of seats for over a decade. And then this is really sort of fascinating. This is legislatures held by party back to 1900. And what's really fascinating, the yellow line are the divided legislatures, blue is Democratic-controlled legislatures, red is Republican-controlled legislatures. And if you look at the right-hand side, you'll see no change in the 2-year election cycle. So essentially, Virginia and New Hampshire offset each other. So there's no change in all 3 of those lines. That's never happened all the way back to 1900, where there wasn't some change in overall legislative control in a 2-year election cycle. As I alluded to just a second ago, Republicans appear to have actually gained seats. This is the hardest number to pin down, and we're getting close. So this is still sort of in the tentative range, but it would appear the Republicans have gained somewhere upwards of 160 seats net in state legislatures. This is in the 2-year election cycle. And as you can see, this is the coattails effect. Of course, Joe Biden, president-elect, coming in, and yet the Democrats are sort of in the red, having lost seats in the election where the Democrats won. So Republicans gained seats where the Democrats won the White House. You have to go back to 1992. Well, I'm sorry, this should be red here in 2004. That was George Bush's midterm election, where he lost a handful of legislative seats. And then the bigger line was in 1992, when Bill Clinton wins the White House, Democrats lose about 150 seats. So this may be the biggest loss for the party winning the White House in legislatures since JFK in 1960. That's just sort of fascinating, and not something we thought we would see in terms of those numbers. This, of course, is the redistricting year. And what this map shows is that the blue states are the ones projected to lose a seat in Congress. Yellow states, the states projected to gain seats in Congress. It's really just sort of symbolic of the fact that redistricting is on the horizon. This is, of course, a big deal, as pretty much everyone on this webinar knows. When you look at the overall sort of balance of power, and then you factor in the many different elements of who controls the redistricting process. Democrats are going to control around 50 of the U.S. House seats, and Republicans are going to control about around 125. When I say control, that is a very nebulous term in many ways, because no one gets to sort of draw their opponents into oblivion. This notion that you can just gerrymander your opponents into oblivion is, I think, somewhat overblown, because the legal limits and constructs around how you do redistricting definitely put some limitations on that. And in fact, in Florida, the voters put in a new constitutional amendment since the last redistricting that requires them to sort of not favor or disfavor one party in the line drawing process. So you can't say that even though, for example, in Florida, Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the governor, they're going to be able to just sort of steamroll districts in a partisan way, because they've got a constitutional limitation on that. So I get a little anxious when I see all these reports about, oh, X party controls this number of seats and vice versa, because it's so complicated. So take some of that with a little bit of salt. I'm going to wrap up. Few key takeaways. Steady states. Only two chambers flip. The lowest since 1944 in this election. 4 chambers if you say the election cycle. Boy, the states just seem to be dialed in with one party or the other kind of driving in sort of a more longer term way than we've seen in modern history. The turnout was the highest. I think you're going to hear a little bit more about that from Wendy, but that was very encouraging, both in total numbers as well as percentages. And speaking of turnover, 1,500 new legislators at a minimum. So as always, a lot of change. So even though the party control didn't change, there's still going to be a lot of change in legislatures. And perhaps the biggest is going to be in the leadership seats, who those speakers and Senate presidents, majority and minority leaders are. And you'll catch a little bit of that from Stacey here in just a second. Redistricting is here. It is around the corner. We'll get the census data soon in the next couple of months, and then it's off and running, and that is going to be a big deal. And I want to make sure you know that NCSL will be having a virtual redistricting training event coming up. You'll hear a little bit more about that from Wendy in just a second. The era of the states continues. It is clear that the states are taking the lead in sort of solving America's problems, whether that has to do with the health crisis and the pandemic, or issues around race and policing, issues around every issue, healthcare, transportation, infrastructure. It's the states that are taking the lead. I think that's going to continue to be the case. The 2021 sessions are going to be different than anything we've ever seen. There will be, of course, more plexiglass. That's one prediction we can safely say. We've already seen this installed in many chambers and committee rooms around the country. It's going to be an unusual session. Unprecedented. A handful of states, of course, before the pandemic really took everybody into their homes in March of this year, a big number of states had already adjourned. So they've had time to sort of look at the other states that adjusted on the fly during the pandemic to try to keep the legislature operating. But I think what you're going to see in January and February when states come into session is, limited access to capitals, certainly more virtual meetings where they can, a hybrid of the two. Some states, of course, have to meet in person. You'll see them maybe going to other venues. It really varies across the country, and we've got some great information on that our staff can share if that's something you're interested in. Thank you so much, Ben. That's going to wrap it up for me, and we really appreciate everybody tuning into the webinar today, and can't wait to hear any questions if you have them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim. That was very, very informative and very, very succinct, which are both really good things, I think. So we have a couple of questions. I'm going to go ahead and ask them. If anyone else, as you're thinking about what Tim has said, feel free to put them in the chat. I see Aaron just dropped one in there. I'm going to ask 2 now. We'll save the rest for the end. But I'm copying them over here to my handy side sheet. So Tim, here's the first one for you. It's from Aaron. And Aaron asks about intra-party dynamics and how even if the top line numbers of Ds and Rs don't change, the natures of the caucuses may be changing and how that has an impact on policy. So her specific question is, the New Mexico Senate technically stayed under Democratic control, but the conservative Dem bloc lost most of their seats, including the president pro tem. It's expected to change the votes significantly, I presume in terms of the policymaking. Are there any other states where you've noticed similar changes within a caucus and how that may have an impact on policy?
Well, a lot of things run through my mind. It's a good question. I'm reluctant to sort of speculate on internal, kind of caucus dynamics. I can say, and that does get into sort of a micro level. And the answer is yes, I have heard about this. And I think you've seen some majorities grow in some states. And sometimes there's a hazard to having too big of a majority. You'll hear that from a lot of legislative leaders. So I'm not going to get into details. I do think there's going to be a lot of sorting out within party caucuses, and that's in both parties. You're of course, everybody's seeing it at the national level in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. But I think there's some real tensions within both parties that are going to play out in these legislative caucuses around the country. We're seeing it a little bit in some of the leadership races. But I will say so far, no big surprises in the leadership races. No leaders that have been thrown out by their caucuses that I can think of. But Stacey's going to answer that question when it gets to her time.
Sure. So great. Thank you. And then the next question is from Valerie. And Valerie is asking if you have any specific insights other than what you've discussed already about the dynamics in the states where the margins were close going into the election and Democrats, at least publicly, were confident about their chances of gaining seats in those chambers. She specifically mentions Arizona, Minnesota, and Iowa. And obviously, in the end, Democrats did gain seats in Arizona and Minnesota, but not enough to flip chambers. And then in Iowa, the Democrats lost a little bit of ground. So do you have any comments on any of those states or anything else that you've seen that is of note to you?
Yeah, I mean, my comment is I'm sort of skeptical of the hot takes that happen right out of the gate. I think these are the kinds of questions that take more time to sort out. And so I'm because I have heard, a little bit about particularly Minnesota and Arizona. I think Iowa was less of a surprise. I think everybody knew that the Democrats had to kind of run the table to get the chamber in Iowa. But I think most people thought that the Democrats were really poised to perhaps take back the majority in the Minnesota Senate and win majorities in Arizona, except of course for, ardent Republicans who, never doubted. So those two things can coexist. I guess I'm reluctant to sort of venture out too far on that limb just yet. But I will more stay tuned, more later.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tim. I think that's an important point to note for members of the audience is that even though we're discussing election results right now, the states are still going through their canvassing process. We still have certification deadlines ahead, and there may be recounts in some of the really close races in some states. So I think it's appropriate with what Tim says to hold off on the absolute final takes maybe for a little bit longer, even if we do have a solid understanding of how legislatures will look next year. And just to that point, I put a link to a resource that we have at NCSL in the chat box, which can give you a little bit more background on the canvassing and certification process in all of the states. So thank you, Tim. We've got other questions for you, but we're going to hold those till the end. And now it's time to turn it over to Wendy Underhill, who's going to talk about election administration. Wendy?
Well, thank you, Ben, and thanks to everybody who's here. I did take a look at the registration, and it looks like we've got quite a number of legislators and legislative staff, and you are our constituents, and so we appreciate that you joined us. And I'll add that we work for you, so please ask us questions anytime now, after the fact as well. So I am going to start with a cliche. You all have heard it many times. This has been a year like no other. Usually when people use that phrase, they're thinking about the pandemic or they're thinking about unusual politics. But I'm thinking that it's unusual in the way we ran our elections. For one thing, this is the first time that the media has given as much attention to the how we run elections as they have to who's on the ballot or what policies might be on the ballot. In fact, I think you could say that the horse race came in second to election administration this time, maybe not right around the Tuesday last week, but for most of the pre-election day activities and even now again afterwards. And then the second thing is that we do have, as Ben was mentioning, there's been an unusual amount of attention to the mechanics of elections and particularly the post-election mechanics. So thanks for dropping that new document in the box there. But the way I'm thinking of elections being really different this year is primarily that so many people, so many voters made the choice to use an absentee or a mail ballot. This was based on COVID. You may remember COVID got going just as primaries were picking up, and many states made many different kinds of changes. They delayed the dates for things. They used the National Guard to make sure that in-person polling places were open. But really, truly, the biggest change was in the mail voting. And in fact, this is kind of what local election officials' offices look like all across the nation. They were surprised by the amount of mail that came flowing through, kind of like Harry Potter was surprised when all of his invitations to Hogwarts came down that chimney and filled up his living room. But I could use words like tsunami and torrent and avalanche, but let's take a look at some numbers on how this has changed. So in 2016, 3/4 of Americans voted in person. That was either on election day or during an early voting period, and 1/4 voted absentee or on mail ballots of one kind or another. And then this year, the numbers are quite different. 43% voted in person, and almost 6 out of 10 people voted on an absentee or a mail ballot. But what I'd like to point out here is that really every single state is running some kind of a hybrid election model. And I say hybrid because in every state, some people can vote absentee or perhaps all. And in virtually every state, in fact, all states, there is some kind of in-person option as well. Where the various states are on the teeter-totter changes quite a lot. This teeter-totter that I've shown you here is the national average. So by making this huge shift, I'd say that the election infrastructure across the nation got quite a workout this year. Lawmakers were really busy this year making sure that they had the right legal framework for running elections in this year that's like no other. And it also meant that election administrators were busy figuring out how to get PPE, how to figure out the social distancing, all those other pieces as well. But on the legislative side, people were adjusting deadlines for asking for and returning ballots and requirements for being able to ask for a ballot and adding more early voting days and adjusting polling place requirements. It was kind of a flurry of legislative action on this. Now, since we do have a number of legislators on the line, I'm a little hesitant to make predictions about what will be happening in the coming year. I will suggest, though, that legislators might be deciding is the balance that they had prior to 2020 what they're looking for, or is the balance they had in 2020 what they're looking for as they decide about the future? I guess I'm offering it could be that this was just an aberration, or it could be the continuation of a trend towards more absentee and early voting. So that's the big story, but there are some other stories too. One is about turnout. The fact is turnout was the highest this year since the turn of the last century. And by that, I mean literally the year 1900. So we are at 66.4% turnout, and that is really quite a marvel. But what does it mean? I'm not really sure. There are a number of things that drive turnout, and one is a high-profile race, and we certainly had that. Every presidential election is obviously a high-profile race, this one perhaps more so than many others. And then the get-out-the-vote efforts this year were really quite remarkable. Of course, Democrats and Republicans each dug as deep as they could to find voters who maybe were first-time voters for them, and did a fine job because we see it worked on both sides. But there's another thing that happened this year in a way that I haven't seen before, and that is that corporations and really got involved as well in voter information, if not exactly literally get out the vote efforts, at least letting people know where they could get solid information. And nonprofit organizations all across the country were embedding get out the vote type materials in all of their other messaging. So it felt like it was a full court press from the parties, as we might expect, but from virtually every other part of America as well, to make sure that voters had every opportunity to know where to vote. And so what will this mean for next year? Again, it's hard to tell whether this was an aberration or if we've really made those first-time voters into habitual voters, and that's what we're looking for. So another thing we learned this year is that elections have timelines. Now, for anybody who's run an election campaign, of course, you know that it doesn't just take place on that first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. You've got the whole campaign timeline leading up to it. But there's a lot of other pieces to the timeline that I'd say the public and the media haven't paid much attention to before, and this year they have. For instance, the first ballots went out to people 46 days before Election Day. That's a long time that early voting was open in one way or another. And then the last ballots to be received and counted will be coming in California, and that's November 20th. Those ballots do have to be postmarked. I'm not suggesting anybody's filling out ballots at this point and submitting them in California. And no one thought about the certification dates until now. And the last of those is on December 9th. And then we know that the Electoral College will gather, and then Congress will get those votes. And then in January, in state capitals all across the nation, there will be swearing in ceremonies. And then that great big one on the U.S. Capitol steps takes place on January 20th. So that timeline is something we haven't thought about a lot before. And it is possible that legislatures will be thinking about, do they have the timeline that's right for their state as we go forward into the next session? Another thing that's new this year in regard to elections is lots and lots and lots of lawsuits. And remember that Harry Potter vision of the ballots flying every which way? It almost feels that way with lawsuits as well. There were at least 450 lawsuits filed before we even got to Election Day. And there's been 19 as of Monday filed that I know of afterwards. In fact, these numbers aren't from me. They're from my colleague, Brian Hinkle. He's been pulling that together for us. So it's not to suggest that there haven't always been lawsuits, but the level of courtroom action has been really ramped up this year. And it might be another indicator that legislatures will be looking at what were the things that were causing the lawsuits, and is there a way for the law to be more explicit to avoid these questions next time? Hard to tell about that, but we do know that there's far more litigation this year than there's ever been before. And on this slide, I want to first focus on the right-hand side and that nice image of calm waters, because that's really how, from an administrative perspective, this election went. It was calm. It was surprisingly calm. We didn't have the things that were on the minds of many election people, that there could be cyber attacks of one kind or another, or a hurricane could hit American soil on Election Day. We didn't even have the super long lines that we've seen in times past. But we did, of course, have the one great big emergency this year, and that was COVID. And I think that the possibility is that states will be looking at what kinds of laws do they have to hold elections when there are emergencies. And NCSL does have some new resources on that we might be able to pop in the chat box there. So emergencies do happen in elections, and there are laws around how to manage in the case of an emergency, but it's really hard to have one law that fits every possible emergency that could come up for us. So I do want to say that this is a year where even though there's a lot of contention right at this moment, kudos are really deserved. Our state lawmakers stood up some very fine elections. There was very little that went awry on the in-person or the absentee voting side of things. And I think that's because of the attention that was paid to policies by lawmakers and then to procedures by election officials. And by election officials, I mean secretaries of state, state election directors, county clerks, right down to the poll workers who are basically volunteers and really came out in numbers that were kind of surprising. Earlier this year, we thought that there wouldn't be enough poll workers. And in the end, America really stood up a great election. So I appreciate that. It is a quilt of 50 different kinds of election administration. And if you're from another country, that looks unusual. But from the United States, 50 states all came up with a solution. The one thing I guess that's been an issue is that we're lots and lots of tight races. We've seen in the chat box that some of the legislative races haven't been called yet. And when races are tight, sometimes we go to recounts. There are these, and there are even procedures in place for if there is a tie election, that kind of thing. And I'll offer that the election administrator's prayer is, Lord, may the margin be wide, so that they don't have those questions about who was the winner. And then on this last slide, I'm hoping that you all will put your ideas in the chat box of what might be coming in terms of elections for beyond 2020. I have 3 thoughts for you, but really, truly, it's up to legislators to be figuring out what they might be looking at doing next year. And I'd be interested in what that is, because NCSL's job is to support your work. And if we know what's on your minds, we'll be able to get ahead a little bit and gather up the right kind of information. But my thoughts, hoping you all will join in, are that states will be deciding whether they want to encourage more absentee voting or they want to go back to the norms prior. and that states will be considering what's the role of the legislature in regard to the executive branch. This is something that comes up in an emergency situation, and not just around elections, but who's got the control? What's the balance of power? I guess the separation of powers. And then in general, I think that a lot of details were brought up, even the question about what happens to the ballot of an absentee voter who dies before Election Day. That's the kind of detail that maybe hasn't been on people's radar before and will be now. So I want to say thanks for listening. And I forgot I had this slide about redistricting. We do have coming up in January a 3-day online seminar about redistricting. It will be sort of soup to nuts. We'll have the nation's experts, and this is meant for Democrats, Republicans, legislators, legislative staff, and the public is welcome to come as well. So consider joining us for that. And then please do feel free to reach out anytime. We work for you, and answering your questions is kind of the lifeline for us. So please let us help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was very informative and a good look, I think, at why election administration is so important. As you said, it's not something that comes up very often, but it clearly was front and center this year, and for good reason. The rules about how people vote and how votes are counted are very relevant to how our elections are run. So we have a few questions for you. I'm going to go ahead and ask one, and then as I've been teasing, I'm holding everyone until the very end for the Q&A. So I'm going to hold a couple until then. But Tim got his question in first, so we're going to ask that. And he wants to know, were there state trends and ballot access changes due to the pandemic? And I think what he's asking is, were there changes that states made on an emergency basis to make it easier to comply with something like signature requirements, for example, in order to be placed on the ballot?
The pandemic was in full swing as people were getting their signatures to run as a candidate or to get citizens initiatives on ballots in the half the states that allow that. And it made it very difficult. And there were some states, and Vermont comes to my mind, that did adjust the requirements based on that. And I don't think we have a way to show with numbers that fewer candidates ran because of that, but it certainly became a struggle for candidates to meet the letter of the law, and there were a handful of states. And Mandy, if you have more on that and want to pop it in the chat box, please do, on states that may have adjusted those requirements. Let us hope that doesn't happen to us again, ever.
Indeed, let's hope not. But hopefully by the time we get to the next fall's elections, we will have the pandemic under control, and we'll have that vaccine out and ready for everyone. We can all go back to meeting in person, like I'm sure we all want to be. So thank you, Wendy. And with that, I see the rest of you, I have your questions saved over here on my other screen, and we're going to get to those at the end. But we have one more speaker up for you, and it's going to be Stacy Householder, who's going to talk to us about leadership. Stacy?
Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's great to see you out there in the virtual world. We're going to jump right in to our legislative leadership updates. And to echo what many have said about the races, there were not very many unexpected leadership upsets in this election. In fact, let's just take a look at the numbers. We expect at least 27 new top leaders, but many of these we knew well in advance of going into the election. In fact, 19 of them we knew were going to be replaced in one way, shape, or another because of term limits or because they voluntarily stepped down because of retirements or they were running for another office, something like that. In fact, I have an asterisk next to our 27 here because that is likely now 29. With the numbers coming in from Puerto Rico, it looks like both chambers in Puerto Rico will have new leadership as well. So this number is constantly changing. Let's talk about some of the other numbers on the slide here. We had 4 leaders who lost their primaries this past summer and spring prior to the election. And that was in the West Virginia Senate, the New Mexico Senate, the Delaware Senate, and the Alaska Senate. We have two legislative leaders who both lost their races on election day. That is the Rhode Island Speaker, Nicholas Mattiello, and the Vermont Speaker, Mitzi Johnson. Though Mitzi lost her election by 18 votes, and her recount will happen next Wednesday. So we'll see if her loss stays on the books or if perhaps the recount turns that around. We'll have to keep watching that. And then, as Tim mentioned, we know for sure the New Hampshire, both chambers in New Hampshire flipped from Democrat to Republican, and it now does look like that the chambers in Puerto Rico have flipped as well, although in the Senate it looks like there might be some kind of coalition that happens there. So we'll have to keep watching about what happens in Puerto Rico. I do want to say that this number at the top, that 27/29 with an asterisk, does not take into account any leadership challenges to sitting leaders who may have won their election but may see a challenge from someone within their caucus. And I'll talk a little bit about that. We know certainly of one, but there could be others as well. I'll jump to the map so you can get an idea of what the layout of the country looks like. This is a map of top leadership changes, top leaders being defined as speakers of the House or the top Senate leader. In most cases, it's the Senate president, but in some states, it is the Senate president pro tem or the Senate majority leader who serves in that top leader position. And I want to point out just a couple of states here. First and foremost, let's talk a little bit about Nevada, which is not highlighted on here, but the Senate majority leader, who is the top leader in the Senate there, is in a very tight race, and that has not yet been called. So it's quite possible that we would see a leadership change there, although she is currently in the lead, so she may eke out a win in her district and remain leader there in Nevada. Connecticut is an interesting case. In fact, between their Senate president and their minority leaders, 3 out of those 4 actually decided to leave the legislature this year. So they have quite a bit of new leadership coming into play there, and many of those leadership positions have already been chosen. I want to point out Alaska on here because I have that colored in orange, although that's not necessarily quite determined yet. We know that we'll see a new leader in the Alaska Senate and the Alaska House, as Tim mentioned. There's several races that are too close to call, but it does look like the Republicans will hold an outright majority in there. And if that's the case, we'll have to watch and see if the coalition leader that exists currently will continue to hold that position. It's quite possible that the Republican caucus may put in a new speaker in that position, but we are still waiting and watching Alaska. I have a star on Wyoming here because Wyoming is unique. Wyoming has a tradition that their leaders serve just one term, although in recent years they have bucked that tradition. So we'll have to wait and see if they continue to do that or if they will select new leaders there in Wyoming. I mentioned that we know of at least one chamber with a speaker challenge, and that is the Oregon House. Speaker Tina Kotek, who has been the speaker there since 2012, has publicly received a challenge from within her caucus. So we'll have to watch how that plays out. In New Hampshire, the New Hampshire House is an interesting one to watch. There are a handful of folks who have declared that they are running for speaker there as well. We'll have to see who comes out on top. In the Senate, the Republicans have coalesced around Chuck Morse, who was the previous Senate president before the Democrats took it over 2 years ago. And then last but not least, I'd like to mention Florida because they have an interesting system that not very many other states do, if any. But in fact, they choose their leaders 7 to 8 years in advance. So you know if you're going to be speaker 7 to 8 years down the road. They choose them when they come in as freshmen, which is an interesting way to choose leadership. But their leaders are already in place because Republicans kept both majorities there. Our talk would not be complete without covering the bipartisan spectrum, and that is that of minority leadership. And we had some interesting upsets on the minority leadership side from this election. In particular, the Pennsylvania House, which on my map is colored in as a maybe, but in fact, just within the last 48 hours, The minority leader there in the House has actually conceded his race. So we will see a new minority leader there in Pennsylvania. And then I have Alaska here as a maybe as well, because again, if the Republicans do outright have the caucus there, then their leader will become speaker, and there will be a different minority leader there in the House as well. South Carolina, just yesterday, it was announced that the Senate minority leader in South Carolina will be stepping down. So we'll see a new minority leader there. And then there were several minority leaders who lost their races this year. Georgia, the House minority leader in Georgia, lost his race. He was actually the last Democrat that represented a rural area in Georgia, and he is now out of the legislature. Kansas, the Senate minority leader in Kansas, lost his race, and the Republican Senate minority leader in Maine lost his race as well. So we'll certainly see some new minority leadership there. A couple of notes about the other states that you see here. In Illinois, the Senate minority leader chose to step down. And in Indiana, in the Senate, they had quite a shakeup of their minority leadership. The current minority leader actually won, but in caucus, they decided to go in a different direction and chose a different minority leader there. So these are the maps for you on leadership, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stacy. And with that, we're going to start going through some of these questions. So let's see. I think I have on here, Mandy, we're going to come to you first. So we have a question from Cheryl, and Cheryl asks on ballot measures, do you know on that Mississippi flag, it had the phrase, "In God We Trust" on it. And do you know if the ACLU or anyone who, like them, is challenging the reference to a deity on the new flag?
So that's an interesting question. "In God We Trust" was a requirement of the legislature when they decided to develop a new flag. And so the various designs all had "In God We Trust" on it. And I'll add that that is the United States official motto. I haven't really seen any major challenges to that. There are some grumbles from organizations that seek to strengthen the separation between church and state, atheist groups, but nothing looks particularly major and organized at this moment. That could change.
Okay, great, thank you. Tim, I'm coming to you next. So we have a question from Annie who asks, you mentioned that New Hampshire has flipped 6 times in the last 8 elections, which sounds like a lot. Maybe it's not a lot in the history of New Hampshire, but it sounds like quite a lot of turnover. Do you have any insights into why New Hampshire has bucked the trend for the year of things not changing, since they were the one state that did have a flip? And whether or not legislatures tend to act a certain way under a new opposite party president. So I guess what she's referring to is with President-elect Biden, if we have a Republican unified control in New Hampshire, do states tend to be more active on the policy front, which I'm going to guess, since it looks like we're going to have divided government at the federal level, the answer is probably the states are going to be more active than Congress.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, let's just look at the last 2 years. In the past 2 years, the 116th Congress of the United States has enacted about 170 pieces of legislation, and around 65 of those are to rename federal buildings post offices, to issue commemorative coins, to appoint board of director members at the Smithsonian, which I didn't know you have to do that with an act of Congress signed by the president. So that had to happen. So you got about 100 pieces of legislation. Now they're acts of Congress. Some of them are big, major, like the stimulus package on COVID, big deal legislation. But at the same time that Congress is enacting about 100 pieces of legislation, some of them, by the way, were just extenders and reauthorizations of laws already on the books. But while they're doing that, legislatures passed about 15,000 pieces of legislation. And when you do have unified government, typically you do see sort of action with party priorities. But man, you can't just say that as a guarantee because so much of it depends on how close the numbers are and that kind of thing. As for the sort of the New Hampshire dynamics, it is fascinating, right? The New Hampshire voters pretty much went with Democrats for all the federal offices. Voted for Biden, I think, with a comfortable margin for Biden. I have to double check that. Jeanne Shaheen won comfortably. Pappas won the congressional seat, one of the 2 congressional seats there. So, New Hampshire voters go for the Democrats at the federal level and strongly for Republicans at the state level. And of course, Sununu, one of the more popular governors, I think that clearly had something to do with it. The other thing about the change dynamic is keep in mind what makes New Hampshire so unique among legislatures. It's the House, not the Senate. The Senate, by the way, is one of the smallest legislative chambers in the country with only 24 members, I believe. The House is with its 400 members. It means that those districts are very small. They're very personal. They've got some multi-member districts, but I think that an average New Hampshire House member represents 3,400 people roughly. So their districts are 3,400 people. So you can, that means the elections. You just got to, knock on 100 more doors, and you're going to swing a district if you're successful with your message. So I think that has a lot to do with it. Is the unique nature of New Hampshire itself.
Right, absolutely. Thank you, Tim. Annie did have a follow-up, so I'm just going to go ahead and throw this one to you as well. And we do have this data at NCSL on our state elections 2020 page, but Tim can answer it here too, which is how many states now have one-party rule where the governor and the legislature are of the same party, so aka trifectas. I know we've got it on the slide going back a little bit. So
I've got it. I'm all over that. Just have to glance at my slide to make sure I get it exactly right. So 24 Republican-controlled states, House, Senate, governor, 15 Democratic-controlled states, and 11 that are divided between the 2 parties. So 24, 15, and 11, and then you got some veto override majorities in there. So that's the end of the day tally. Hey, can I say something about the election administration that Wendy touched on a minute ago? One thing that has been striking to myself and to Wendy is people who've been watching this for over 20 years and remember the days of Bush v. Gore. I think one thing that people don't really appreciate is how vastly different the regime of election law is today than it was 20 years ago. States went through a complete revolution on their election laws. The election code of today is so much more advanced than it was 20 years ago. And I think that's part of the reason that this election in some ways went as smoothly as it did. Still incredibly close, but the election laws are far better prepared. There's far less ambiguity for election officials in terms of how they, run the election, count the votes, present the votes, and all of that. So it's a really important point, I think, that Wendy and I have been thinking about a good bit.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Tim. And we've got a lot of questions, by the way. So thank you to the audience for putting those in the chat box. And I'm going to be going from person to person to keep it moving a little bit. But speaking of election admin, Wendy, we're coming to you next. And we have a question from Senator Kagan, who would like to know, is there a way that people can swap ideas through a centralized NCSL portal of some sort? She's referring to the idea that there's going to probably be, as you alluded to in your presentation, a lot of legislation around keeping or removing the temporary changes that were made due to COVID. So is that something NCSL does? Wendy, you're muted.
I was so excited to answer. Senator Kagan, that's something you and I could maybe invent something for. Right at the moment, what I've got to offer is that the elections and redistricting team at NCSL is holding office hours twice a month on the second, fourth Tuesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern time, where anybody can come and talk about anything. And that is legislators, legislative staff are all welcome to join us. And that's where we're hoping that some amount of this kind of informal conversation can get going. So hold that thought. And then the second thing is that next week, the Redistricting and Elections Standing Committee that Senator Kagan is on is having its priority setting conversation. That's a week from today. And while we're looking for the members of that committee to participate, we're happy to take ideas from other folks. But I think what you're getting at is more of just a dashboard or where people could throw in some ideas and see what sticks. And I don't know how to do that exactly, but I do think it's a good idea to get a little more conversation across state lines, you might say. So let me think about that, and I'll be back in touch with you on that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Wendy. And then we have one more question for you. It's from Simon, who asks, are any states looking to make permanent, I guess I just alluded to this, any of the changes, any of the temporary changes that were made this year? And his examples that he cites, although I think you can touch on any of them, are drop boxes, absentee ballot, mailing, et cetera.
I think the answer has got to be yes, but of course we'll wait and see what gets thrown in the hopper. On the ballot boxes, I wanted to particularly say that there are 8 states that have statutes that identify what security looks like for them, that they have to have 24-hour cameras and they have to be a certain weight and so that they can't be easily moved. And there are various design features that 8 states have put into place, and we can share that with you. And I'm guessing that because ballot boxes became a hot issue this year, that other states that are now having them for the first time might be saying, hey, do we want to put some definition around this? Not surprisingly, those 8 states are states that are heavy users of mail voting. So that's why they would get there first, but I'm guessing that that's one we might see coming forward. And then there are many, many policy choices that are sort of, the big one is more mail voting or less mail voting. But underneath that, there's many, many, many small pieces that I think states could be looking at. And we're happy to help with any of that, with voting outside the polling place resources or otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Wendy. And for those of you who maybe legislators who are new coming in, legislative staff who haven't necessarily worked with the elections team before, we do have a general email inbox, elections-info@ncsl.org. You can send us an email there with your question or your idea, and we'll get back to you. So with that, I'm going to transition back over to you, Mandy. And we have a question from Thomas, who's asking, was there a campaign against the minimum wage increase in Florida? And I think this is getting at the idea that even though they aren't candidates running for office, there are often campaigns that are behind particular ballot measures, pro and con.
Yes, absolutely. So citizen initiatives especially tend to have proponents and opponents, and the minimum wage effort in Florida was no different. The name of the main group was Save Florida Jobs. In general, like, they had various groups support, but for that measure in particular, the supporters far outspent the opponents in that particular campaign.
Wonderful, thank you. And then we have another question from Aaron, who asks, you mentioned that the ballot questions that were as a result of citizens initiatives were down this year compared to prior years, but how did the legislative referrals compare to prior cycles?
So the legislative referrals were kind of smack dab in the middle of what we expect from legislatures in terms of numbers. 77 this year. Past general election years, I think in 2018, it might have been like 81, and 2016, somewhere in the 70s as well. So we know that the pandemic affected essentially every aspect of our lives, but it doesn't seem to have a big effect on the legislative referrals. And I speculate that that's largely because they didn't have to go out and gather signatures to get those questions on the ballot. They could, put them there themselves with the vote. And so many of those also were placed on the ballot before the pandemic even happened.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mandy. Let's see. Wendy, I see I missed a question from Thomas, so I'm going to come back to you really quick, and then we're going to wrap up with Tim. But the question to you, Wendy, is, well, so we know that in certain states, the mail ballots were counted before the in-person ballots, and then in other states, it was the reverse. Do you know why in Michigan and Pennsylvania, the processing of ballots started on Election Day?
Thanks, Ben. And I do want to say that the counting of the ballots is always held for Election Day, or virtually always held. But you're right about processing sometimes can happen beforehand. And a number of states were making efforts to do that. And Michigan did move its processing forward, perhaps not as much as some advocates for that wanted, but they did move it forward by a day. And in Pennsylvania, that was a back and forth between the governor and the folks in the legislature would say that the governor was the holdup on that. So I'm going to stick with that. I'm sure that these are things that are going to come up again. Does it make sense to be opening ballots before Election Day, or does it not? A state-by-state decision. And it kind of ended up relating to the question we had about whether a voter who had submitted an absentee ballot but wanted to change her mind could do that, which we heard a little bit about in the week before. And once the ballots are separated from the envelope, there's no changing your mind. Once the ballot is accepted, you can't pull it back out. So maybe that's a part of the picture as well.
Great, thank you, Wendy. And I see that we just got a question in on leaders. So Stacy, I'm going to come over to you. Do you have any intel on the challenge to the speaker in Oregon?
Thanks, Ben. Well, it's certainly not my place to speculate about internal caucus deliberations, but there has been an announced challenger. It's been announced in the media. So both candidates, the current speaker as well as the challenger, will now work with the caucus and try to gather up the votes that each of them would need in order to become speaker.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stacy. And then Tim, we've got two more questions for you, and then we're going to wrap up for the day. So the first one is from Simon, and I know you've already touched on this a little bit, but if you want to elaborate further, are there any general theories as to why there was so much stability in state elections this year? And I know you and I have looked at the data, and that the stability is quite historic. So do you have any additional thinking about why that is?
Well, I think that's sort of a political scientist question that's going to take, months and years to sort of figure out. Again, the hot take is not a lot of ticket splitting, right? That the states that went Republican at the top at the presidential level pretty much went Republican in the legislatures, and same for Democrats. So it does seem like we have really dialed ourselves into these blue states and red states at some level. I think there was so much money spent on legislative elections, and maybe it just wound up offsetting each other. And let's keep in mind how close this whole thing is, right? That even at the top, it appears that Biden is going to win win 4 states. Wisconsin, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Georgia by about 100,000 votes. And that's the difference in the Electoral College. Just like, Trump won 3 states by about 75,000 votes, if is my memory. So it's still very, very close. And it doesn't look like voters are moving dramatically from one party to the other right now. They're really just dialed in with their 2 parties.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And then, Tim, your favorite subject for the very last question, it's a redistricting question. And it's from Aaron. And his question is, how many U.S. seats are projected to be reapportioned, and how does this compare to recent decades? I think that another thing that you could address in answering this, if you'd like, is can you explain the difference between redistricting and reapportionment?
Well, what a great question, Ben. Of course, I can answer the question in reapportionment. So I think the question is specifically about reapportionment. How many seats in the U.S. House, which is fixed at 435, how many of those seats will be moving from one state to the other based on the new census data? There are multiple projections on that, but let's keep in mind that the census will be different. It might be just as good. It might not be quite as good. We don't know until that census data gets reported. Because this was the pandemic census. It all happened in the middle of a global pandemic, the entire census process. Well, not the getting ready for it. That takes a decade. But so there could be some surprises. Before, when you're just looking at population trends, throughout the entire decade based on really the Census Bureau's population estimates, which come from ACS and other places, it would appear that there were 9 states, 10 states that were going to lose seats, and 2, 4, 6, 7 that we're going to gain seats. 3 going to Texas, 2 to Florida. So let me think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Only about 10 states moving in the reapportionment process. And of course, that comes from what's called the method of equal proportions. It's a formula that's in the U.S. Code, which basically guarantees every state gets 1 member of Congress. And it could be, by the way, that the number of states that only have 1 member of Congress in the U.S. House, which is now 7, could go to 6, because Montana is projected to go from 1 seat in the U.S. House to 2 seats in the U.S. House. So that would be a change in the reapportionment. So reapportionment is not redistricting. Reapportionment is the word that has to do with the clerk of the U.S. House taking the census data and just basically putting it through that formula and saying, this is how many seats in the House you get. One last point. I have to do a callback to Wendy Underhill just a minute ago, saying that there are 8 states that have specific statutory language about ballot pickup boxes or drop-off boxes. And the reason I do that is to point out that it is just remarkable, and I am so proud of the team of people on this call and the team of people that are supporting all of you guys, that Wendy, off the top of her head, can just pull that out. Like, there are maybe like 197 different election-related issues where you could say, oh, 21 states do this, or 14 states do that, or 38 states do this. And she says 8 states have language in their codes to protect around security of drop-off boxes. So it's just amazing what you guys have done. I hope the people on the call appreciate that. And I just thank you for everybody being on the call. And thank you to Ben for being a good host, and to the NCSL staff for all your work.
Thank you, Tim. And with that, we have come to the end of the briefing. I want to thank everyone for staying with us. And if you wouldn't mind, once this ends, please stay on the line for a quick survey. We'd love to get your feedback on how we can improve our webinars in the future. And most of all, thank you to Amanda, Tim, Wendy, and Stacy. This has been a wonderful hour and a half. Please stay in touch. Goodbye, everybody.